You know it's a staple in so many pantries? Canned seafood. Tuna, sardines, maybe some mussels. Seems pretty straightforward, right?
Very common.
But what if I told you there's something else potentially lurking in those cans?
Uh,
That's our deep dive today. Microplastics found in canned seafood. It sounds, well, kind of mundane, but it holds this surprising potential issue.
exactly. And our mission today is really to unpack this without, overwhelming you. We want to understand the extent of this contamination, the kinds of microplastics involved,
Right.
and maybe most importantly, what it might mean for you listening in, wanting to be informed without getting lost in dense scientific papers.
Think of this as your express lane to understanding this emerging issue and our roadmap. It's this really interesting piece of research published just this year, 2024, in Food Chemistry.
Right. The title is Uncovering Microplastics Contamination in Canned Seafood.
And what's great is they didn't just look at, say, tuna. They checked out a whole variety of sardines in different sauces, tuna, mussels, even octopus.
Octopus, yeah.
And they looked at both the fish itself, the solid bits, and the liquid it's packed in. So, okay, let's get into it. What did they find overall? Like, the big picture.
Well, the headline finding is pretty direct.
Yeah.
All the types of canned seafood they looked at showed signs of microplastics.
All of them. Wow.
Yeah. Across all the samples, they found an average of about 3.5 microplastics per can. But, and this is important, the standard deviation was quite high, 5.2.
Meaning it varied a lot.
Exactly. It tells us the number in individual cans really fluctuated. Some had, significantly more than that average. Others had fewer, some even none.
Okay.
But nearly half, 45% of the 60 cans they checked had these tiny plastic particles in them.
So it wasn't just a couple of outliers. That's a pretty significant chunk. Now, when we say microplastics, it's not all the same stuff, is it? What kinds were they finding?
That's right. They categorized them by shape. The most common by far were fibers. That was about 75% of what they found.
Fibers like little threads.
Yeah, exactly. Slender, thread-like particles. Then they found fragments. Those are more like irregularly shaped hard bits, maybe with broken edges. That was about 18%.
Okay.
And finally, films, like tiny pieces of, plastic film or sheets. That made up the last 8%.
Fibers, fragments, and films.
Got it.
Almost like a tiny plastic confetti mix. And colors. Did they track that? I imagine that might give clues about where they're coming from.
They definitely did track color. And interestingly, blue was the most common color they saw.
Blue.
Yeah, almost 38% of the microplastics were blue. And it popped up in all the types of canned seafood they studied.
Huh. Any idea why blue?
Well, the researchers hypothesized it might be linked to all the blue fishing nets and ropes out there, they break down in the ocean.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Beyond blue, transparent was also pretty common, about 30%. Then smaller amounts of black, red, yellow, purple, white, green.
Blue in everything, though. That's really striking.
It is.
Now, we know they're microplastics, but how micro are we talking? What was the size range?
It varied quite a bit. They found particles from 50 micrometers all the way up to 3,000 micrometers.
Which is 3 millimeters, right?
Exactly, 3 millimeters. The average size was around 789 micrometers. But maybe what's more telling is that almost half, 45%, were smaller than 500 micrometers.
Okay, perspective check. How big is 500 micrometer?
Well, think about a human hair that's typically around 70 micrometers wide. So 500 is bigger, but still pretty small. Many would be tough to see without magnification, especially mixed in with food.
Right, so really tiny stuff. And they went beyond just shape and size, didn't they? They actually figured out what kind of plastic it was.
Absolutely. They used a technique, FTIR spectroscopy.
Fancy name.
It basically identifies the chemical fingerprint. And the most common polymer they found was polyester, PES. That was about 26%.
Polyester, like in clothes?
Yeah, textiles, but also packaging. Then came polypropylene, PP, and polyethylene, PE.
Polyester, polypropylene, polyethylene, rayon, nylon, polyvinyl. Wow, that's quite a list. And yeah, those are materials we see everywhere. Textiles, packaging, fishing gear, probably.
Exactly. It starts to hint at the potential sources, which we can circle back to.
Okay. So we've established these tiny plastics are there, various shapes, colors, materials. Did it matter what kind of seafood was in the can? Did some have more than others?
That's a key question, and yes, they did find differences. The highest levels per can. They found those in octopus, in tomato sauce, and also tuna in olive oil.
Octopus and tuna.
Both averaged around 5.2 microplastics per can.
Okay. And the lowest?
On the other end, sardine in sunflower oil had the lowest average, just zero point 0.2 microplastics per can. And interestingly, that was the only type where they didn't find any microplastics in the actual fish tissue itself.
None in the sardine tissue itself, just maybe in the oil.
Seems so. Based on their findings for that specific product, it might suggest something about the processing or maybe how sardines accumulate less.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Wow, that is a stark contrast. Octopus and tuna high, sardines and sunflower oil low, at least in the fish. And where in the can were they finding these things mostly? In the fish or in the liquid?
That's another significant point. They found considerably more microplastics in the seafood tissues themselves.
Really?
Yeah, about 65% of the microplastics they found were actually in the tissues, compared to only 35% in the immersion liquids, like the oil or sauce.
So you're actually more likely to eat them by eating the fish, not just the sauce?
Yeah.
That's good to know, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned some specific cases, too, like some only had plastics in one part.
Exactly. For mussels in escabeche and chub mackerel in sunflower oil, they only found microplastics in the tissues. None detected in the sauce or oil.
Okay.
But conversely, like we just said, the sardine and sunflower oil seem to only have them in the oil, not the tissue.
That's fascinating. It really highlights how complex this is, how contamination might happen differently depending on the fish and the process. You mentioned tomato sauce earlier. With the octopus, did that play a role?
Well, it's an interesting observation they made. The two products packed in tomato sauce, the octopus and a type of sardine, did show higher microplastic levels, either in the tissues or the liquid.
Huh.
The researchers wondered if maybe it's because tomato sauce often has more ingredients than just oil or brine. More ingredients, potentially more chances for contamination to sneak in.
Makes sense. More handling, more sources.
Intentionally. But they did run the stats, and they didn't find a statistically significant link between the number of ingredients and the microplastic count. So it's like an intriguing hint, but not definitive proof yet.
Still a bit of a puzzle then. Okay, we see the microplastics are there, varying amounts, maybe linked to ingredients, maybe not. The big question, where are they coming from? What are the likely sources?
The study points to a couple of main routes. First, and probably not surprising, the marine environment itself. It's just, well, full of microplastics now.
Right, pollution.
Seafood comes into direct contact with it. Think about plankton-eating fish like sardines or mackerel. They might just gulp down microplastics along with their food.
Okay.
Filter feeders, like mussels, they're constantly filtering water, so they naturally pull in microplastics from their surroundings.
Makes sense.
Octopus, they mentioned, might interact with plastic debris, maybe even use it for shelter sometimes. And then predatory fish, like tuna, eat smaller fish.
Which might have already eaten plastic.
Exactly. So it builds up the food chain. That's called bioaccumulation. The microplastics concentrate in the bigger predators.
So the whole food web is involved? That's
right.
Yeah, sobering. But it's not just the ocean, right? The study mentioned handling and processing, too.
Yes, that's the second major pathway.
Yeah.
Human handling and all the industrial steps to get the seafood into the can.
Like what?
It could start right from fishing nets, shedding fibers, storage containers, then the cleaning, the processing, evisceration, removing the guts. That could transfer plastics from the digestive tract to the parts we eat.
Oh, I hadn't thought of that.
Even things like air cooling after cooking could introduce airborne microplastics. And then actually filling the cans, apparently. Some of that is still done by hand.
Manual filling. Still.
Seems so, which increases the risk. And finally, the added ingredients themselves, the salt, the sauces, spices, they could potentially carry microplastics too.
Wow. It sounds like there are just multiple potential entry points all along the way, from the sea to the shelf. No single smoking gun.
That seems to be the picture, yes.
Now, this study isn't the very first to look at microplastics in seafood generally, but they said research on canned seafood specifically is still limited. How do these findings compare to other studies?
That's right. There's more research on fresh seafood, but canned is catching up. And these findings do generally align with studies on fresh versions of the same species. Sardines, tuna, octopus, mussels, mackerel, where microplastics have also been found.
Okay.
They also mentioned a few other studies specifically on canned products, tuna, salmon, sardines again, and those also found contamination.
But the amounts varied.
Yeah, the amounts and sometimes the types of plastics reported can differ quite a bit between studies. And the researchers here suggest that's likely due to differences in how the studies were done.
Different methods.
Exactly. Different ways of getting the plastics out, different ways of analyzing them. It really underlines the need for more standardized methods so we can actually compare results properly across studies.
Right, so we can get a clearer, consistent picture. Okay, so we're building that picture, but it's still a bit fuzzy. Let's get to the part everyone's probably thinking about. What does this mean for us? If we eat canned seafood, how much plastic are we talking, and should we be worried?
Well, based on their findings, they calculated an average of about 0.043 microplastics per gram of the seafood tissue and using U.S. consumption data.
Okay, specific to the U.S. here.
Right, which suggests people eat about 2 kilograms of canned seafood a year on average.
Mm.
Doing the math, they estimated a potential maximum intake of around 226 microplastics per year per person just from canned seafood.
226 a year. And you emphasize potential and maximum.
Exactly. It's an estimate. It depends heavily on how much you actually eat, and consumption patterns vary a lot by country.
226. It doesn't sound enormous, but I guess it adds up with other sources. And what are the health concerns?
That's the critical question.
Sure.
The study points to existing research, mostly in animals, which has shown various negative effects from microplastic exposure. Things like oxidative stress, DNA damage, reproductive issues, even mortality in some cases.
With animals?
In animals, yes. So there are concerns that similar risks could exist for humans, but the researchers stress that the actual toxicity really depends on many factors. Like the particle size, what chemicals might be attached to the plastic, and the overall dose, how much you're actually exposed to over time.
Yeah.
We definitely need more research specifically on human health impacts to really understand the risks.
So the jury is still out on direct human harm at these levels, but the animal studies are a red flag and there are still unknowns. And you mentioned dose, which links back to how much canned fish someone eats. Is any of this regulated right now? Are there limits?
Currently, no. No food products, seafood included, have regulations specifically for microplastic presence. It's still a pretty new area for food safety rules.
Right, so we're just starting to map the territory and the rules haven't caught up. Okay, let's try to wrap this up. What are the key takeaways from this deep dive into microplastics in canned seafood?
I think the main one is pretty clear. Microplastics are indeed present in a variety of the canned seafood you find on shelves. Fibers seem to be the most common type found, and you're generally more likely to find them in the fish tissue itself rather than just the oil or sauce.
And the sources seem to be twofold: pollution already in the ocean and then potential contamination during processing and canning.
Exactly. And this study really highlights the need for more research. We need to get a better handle on the potential health risks for humans, figure out if there are safe limits.
Right.
And also, we need to dig deeper into where exactly the contamination happens during fishing and processing. If we know that, we can maybe find ways to prevent it more effectively.
Makes sense. So, as you, our listener, maybe reach for that next can of tuna or sardines, it's worth thinking about that whole journey, isn't it? From the ocean to the can. Are microplastics just an unavoidable part of that now? And what can we, as informed consumers or as a society, actually do about this wider issue of plastic pollution messing with our food chain? Definitely something to chew on. Thanks for diving deep with me on this.
Glad to be here.